The jungle does not speak of what it saw. It only holds the silence, a heavy, humid blanket woven from heat and the scent of damp earth, draped over a clearing carved from its heart. The air is thick, still, broken only by the drone of insects, indifferent witnesses to a history that the trees have absorbed into their very rings. Here, on November 18, 1978, a dream did not just die, it was methodically, ritually executed. It was a dream of a better world, a sanctuary from injustice, that ended in a chilling, orderly surrender to oblivion. Beneath the indifferent Guyanese sun, a scene of impossible stillness unfolds. More than 900 bodies lay scattered like fallen leaves after a storm, their forms dotting the red earth around a central pavilion. Men, women, and children, dressed in their simple, communal clothes, lie side by side, some in family clusters with arms wrapped around each other in a final, tragic embrace. An abandoned doll here, a dropped book there, ghosts of lives interrupted mid-sentence. They were not victims of a foreign enemy, a plague, or a natural disaster. They were the architects of their own end, the congregation of a final, horrifying sermon delivered not with words, but with poison. At the epicenter of this quiet apocalypse, a metal vat holds the dregs of a grape-flavored drink, its sweetness a grotesque mask for the cocktail of cyanide and sedatives mixed within. Scattered around it are the paper cups that delivered this sacrament of death. This was a communion, a final act of loyalty, a terrifying testament to a faith that had twisted itself into a pact with oblivion. This was Jonestown, the promised land built by the People's Temple, a place that offered belonging and purpose but demanded the ultimate price in return. How does a movement born from the most noble of ideals, racial equality, social justice, communal support, devolve into a death cult on an unprecedented scale? What kind of psychological alchemy can transform hope into a weapon of self-destruction? And what of the man at its heart, the charismatic preacher who offered salvation with one hand and orchestrated mass suicide with the other? This is not just the story of a singular madman, though his shadow looms large over every fallen body. It is a far more complex and unsettling narrative. It is a story of faith, of profound, desperate belief. It is a story of fear, fear of the outside world, fear of failure, and ultimately fear of the leader himself. It is an exploration into the terrifying fragility of the human mind when it surrenders its autonomy, when the need to belong becomes more powerful than the instinct to survive. What void existed in the lives of these 900 souls that only a promise of utopia, however flawed, could fill? What happens when a community isolates itself so completely that its leader's voice becomes the only reality, his paranoia the only truth? The story of Jonestown is a dark mirror held up to our own society. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable line between devotion and destruction, between a charismatic leader and a manipulative tyrant, between a community and a cult. It is a journey into the heart of a failed utopia, to understand how the path to paradise can lead directly to the grave, and to ask the most chilling question of all: could it happen again? To understand the fall, we must first understand the ascent. The story of the People's Temple does not begin in the humid, suffocating jungles of Guyana, but in the fractured, anxious heart of mid-20th century America. It was an era of profound and unsettling contradictions. A nation that broadcasted images of suburban prosperity while its inner cities decayed. A society that preached liberty and justice for all while enforcing brutal segregation through law and custom. The air itself felt heavy, thick with the ambient dread of the Cold War and the constant low-level hum of nuclear anxiety. At the same time, the seismic tremors of the civil rights movement were shaking the country's foundations, challenging old hierarchies and exposing deep-seated hypocrisies. Old certainties were crumbling like statues in an earthquake, and into the cracks of this broken foundation, new prophets and ideologies emerged, all offering alternative visions of the American dream. It was a landscape of profound spiritual and social hunger, a collective yearning for meaning and community in a world that felt increasingly chaotic and impersonal. A vacuum was waiting to be filled. Into this vacuum stepped a man named James Warren Jones. He didn't initially appear as a radical figure demanding a break from tradition. Instead, he presented himself as a radical fulfillment of Christianity's most compassionate promises. At a time when Sunday morning was the most segregated hour in America, the People's Temple was a startling, almost utopian anomaly. It was a rainbow family, a living, breathing testament to a racial harmony that seemed impossible elsewhere. Here, Black, white, Asian, and Latino members were not just tolerated alongside each other, they were woven into the fabric of a single, interdependent family. They shared meals, homes, finances, and a powerful unifying belief that they were not just practicing faith, but actively building a better world, a sanctuary from the hate, poverty, and hypocrisy that festered outside their walls. This was the initial potent allure of the temple. It was not just a church, it was a comprehensive solution to life's cruelties. For the elderly and forgotten, it offered community, dignity, and care. For the poor and disenfranchised, it provided a robust social safety net with food, housing, and legal aid when the state had failed them. For the African American community, it was a rare refuge from the daily indignities and dangers of systemic racism, led by a white man who spoke their language of struggle. For idealistic white liberals, it was a chance to finally put their progressive principles into tangible action. And at the center of it all was Jones, the charismatic, tireless father figure. He was a master of performance, a champion of the underdog who could preach with the fire of a Southern Baptist minister and organize with the precision of a political strategist. He seemed to perform miracles of healing, commanded the attention of powerful politicians, and promised his flock not a distant paradise in the afterlife, but a heaven on earth, right here, right now. But this heaven on earth demanded a toll, one paid not in a single dramatic sacrifice, but in 1,000 small, almost imperceptible surrenders. The ultimate price was autonomy, the very essence of the self. It began with the wallet, then the house, then the will. To be part of the family, one had to surrender everything to it. Not just a tithe, but entire paychecks, Social Security benefits, homes, and life savings were to be placed into a common pot. It was framed as the ultimate act of communal living, the purest form of apostolic socialism where all were provided for, a sacred trust. But the vault was his alone. By severing the financial cord that tied members to the outside world, Jones made the temple not just their spiritual home, but their sole source of survival. This financial umbilical cord, once cut, could not be easily reattached. Dependency was the first and most crucial brick in the wall of their eventual prison. Inside this burgeoning sanctuary, the psychological architecture of control was being meticulously constructed. The family unit, the cornerstone of traditional society, was deliberately and systematically eroded. Jones became Dad, the ultimate patriarch whose authority was divine and unquestionable. Loyalty to him was expected to supersede loyalty to spouses, parents, or children. Marriages were arranged and dissolved at his whim, treated as strategic pairings to strengthen the collective, not as bonds of love. The primary tool for this psychic demolition was the long, grueling meeting that stretched late into the night. In halls thick with exhaustion and forced intimacy, members were encouraged, then pressured, to confess their deepest fears, insecurities, and transgressions. These confessions were not whispered in private, but shouted into a microphone, their vulnerabilities laid bare before the entire congregation. This practice, masked as therapeutic catharsis, shattered personal boundaries and fostered an environment of mutual surveillance. Love was conditional, a reward for absolute transparency and obedience. Children, praised for their purity, were encouraged to report on the dissonant whispers of their own parents, turning the home from a sanctuary into an outpost of the leader's all-seeing gaze. But this is just the first layer of this story. To consolidate his power, Jones understood he needed to physically isolate his flock. The next phase of this psychological siege required a change of geography. In the mid-1960s, he orchestrated a mass exodus from their roots in Indiana to a new promised land in Redwood Valley, California. This was a masterstroke of manipulation. The journey was cast as a modern-day exodus, a righteous pilgrimage away from the wickedness of the Babylon of the Midwest. Uprooted from familiar surroundings, extended families, and old friends, the members' world shrank until it contained only the temple. Their isolation bred a deeper reliance on the community and on the one man who defined its reality. It was here, amidst the golden hills of California, that Jones's paranoia began to fully bloom and infect the collective consciousness. He preached of an imminent apocalypse with terrifying certainty. Race wars would drench the streets in blood. A fascist government would round up dissenters into concentration camps, and nuclear fire would cleanse the decadent cities. The outside world was not just flawed, it was a condemned vessel sinking into a sea of chaos, and they were the chosen few, the righteous remnant, huddled together on the only ark that could weather the coming storm. Every external criticism, every skeptical news article was twisted into proof of this persecution, further tightening the bonds of their shared delusion and justifying the leader's increasingly absolute control. This absolute control was not maintained by sermons alone. Inside the isolated world of the People's Temple, a new, more terrifying psychological architecture was being constructed. The breaking point arrived not as a single event, but as a slow, corrosive process that dismantled the private self. Jones instituted grueling public meetings known as catharsis sessions, often held late at night when exhaustion had worn down every defense. In a crowded hall, under the glare of bare light bulbs that offered no place to hide, members were coerced into confessing their deepest fears, their smallest transgressions, and often sins they had not even committed. These were not gatherings of spiritual uplift, but tribunals of ritual humiliation. A member would be brought to the front, their face pale in the harsh light, and subjected to an interrogation led by Jones himself. Confessions were extracted like teeth. A fleeting thought of doubt about the cause, a pang of longing for a family member left behind, a moment of personal pride. These were magnified into monstrous betrayals of the collective. The atmosphere was thick with a mixture of fear and fervent righteousness, as the crowd was goaded into participating, shouting accusations and demanding repentance. It was a grotesque theater of cruelty designed to shatter the individual ego and weld the fragments to the will of the leader. Trust, the invisible thread that holds a community together, evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, intricate web of mutual surveillance. Spouses began to watch each other with suspicion. Parents measured their words, terrified that an innocent childhood complaint could be reported and twisted into a sign of dissent. Jones systematically dismantled the family unit, positioning himself as the one true father to all. The only safe relationship, the only source of validation or forgiveness was with him. All other loyalties were a threat. When psychological pressure was not enough, physical punishment followed. What began as paddling for minor infractions escalated into severe, ritualized beatings administered publicly to make an example of the disobedient. The victim was often forced to thank Jones for the purification, for the loving discipline that would save their soul from their own weakness. This perverse logic turned cruelty into an act of salvation, further blurring the lines between love and abuse in the minds of the followers. Behind the scenes, Jones's own grip on reality was fraying, accelerated by a cocktail of prescription drugs that fueled his messianic complex. His paranoia metastasized. He saw enemies everywhere, in the CIA, in the press, and most insidiously within his own ranks. His late-night sermons became rambling, apocalyptic prophecies, painting vivid pictures of a world consumed by nuclear fire and racial warfare. The community became a mirror of his own tormented mind. The dream of a utopian sanctuary in California had soured into a paranoid fortress under siege. The outside world, he preached, was closing in. There was only one option left, a final exodus. He began to speak of a place so remote, so far from the corruption of America, that they could finally build their paradise on earth. He called it Jonestown. It was sold to them as a tropical Eden, a socialist paradise in the jungles of Guyana. But what was sold as the ultimate promised land was already being prepared as the ultimate prison. Here begins the darkest part of the journey. The exodus to Guyana was methodical and absolute, a final burning of bridges. Members liquidated their assets, signed over legal custody of their children, and surrendered their passports. Each signature was a brick in the wall of their own prison, a deliberate severing of the final threads connecting them to the world they were leaving behind. They boarded planes not as immigrants, but as soldiers being deployed to a final sacred battleground, convinced they were escaping an America on the brink of self-destruction. Upon arrival, the first sight of Jonestown could have been mistaken for a miracle carved from the dense Guyanese jungle. But the illusion was as thin as the humid air that clung to their skin. The jungle was not a protective barrier, it was a cage. Its ceaseless alien sounds were the ambient noise of their profound isolation. There was no way out that wasn't controlled by Jones's armed guards who patrolled the perimeter. Life in Jonestown was a relentless grind. The socialist utopia was, in practice, a sun-scorched labor camp. The day was filled with back-breaking work under a merciless tropical sun. The food was meager and monotonous, and malnutrition became a silent epidemic, hollowing out the faces of the faithful while Jones and his inner circle ate well. Their collective health withered, but their leader's voice was stronger than ever. It was inescapable. From loudspeakers mounted throughout the settlement, Jones's voice droned on, day and night, a constant, invasive presence that saturated every moment of their existence. There was no privacy, no silence, no thought that wasn't interrupted by the voice of Father. But what happened next is even more disturbing. As despair began to fester, Jones introduced a new, horrific ritual to extinguish the last embers of resistance: the White Nights. An alarm would sound, often in the dead of night, herding everyone to the central pavilion. There, Jones would announce that the only honorable escape was revolutionary suicide. Vats of flavored drink, allegedly laced with cyanide, would be brought out. The true horror was his insistence that parents administer the potion to their children first. The pavilion would fill with the sounds of wailing and raw terror. After an agonizing period, Jones would reveal it was only a test. "You must be ready to die for what we believe," he would say. The damage was done. The line between life and death had been blurred. He was conditioning them not just to die for him, but to want to die for him. Jones himself was a shadow of the charismatic leader he once was. Bloated and ravaged by a cocktail of prescription drugs, his mind was a fever swamp of conspiracy theories and messianic delusions. He ruled through his security force, the Red Brigade, who enforced his increasingly erratic commands. The dream of a racial utopia had decayed into a cult of personality centered on a broken, paranoid man. Jonestown was no longer a sanctuary. It was a mass grave waiting to be filled. The air itself felt heavy, not just with moisture, but with a collective, unspoken dread. This dread would soon find its voice, a scream that would echo across decades. It was catalyzed by the arrival of an outsider, a crack in the hermetically sealed world Jones had built. Congressman Leo Ryan, responding to desperate pleas from concerned relatives back in the States, arrived in Guyana in November 1978 to investigate claims of abuse. His delegation was met with a meticulously staged performance of Utopia, singing, dancing, and smiling faces. But beneath the surface, the pressure was building. Secret notes were slipped into the hands of journalists. Whispered pleas for help were exchanged in fleeting moments of privacy. Ryan's presence was a spark in a powder keg, and when a handful of members made the courageous choice to leave with him, Jones's paranoid worldview collapsed entirely. The utopia was breached. The betrayal was, in his mind, absolute, a public repudiation of his divinity. The tragic events at the Port Kaituma airstrip, where Ryan and 4 others were ambushed and murdered on the tarmac, were merely the violent prelude to the final horrific act. The aftermath left a permanent, jagged scar on the collective psyche. Jonestown became more than a name. It became a cautionary tale, a dark shorthand for blind faith and manipulative control. The images that emerged from the jungle, rows upon rows of bodies lying face down around the central pavilion, a silent testament to a failed dream, were seared into public memory. They fundamentally altered how society viewed new religious movements, fueling a cult panic that painted them all with the same broad, terrifying brush. Any group that seemed unconventional, that was led by a charismatic figure, was now viewed through the distorted lens of Jonestown. This climate of fear and suspicion often erased nuance, failing to distinguish between genuine spiritual exploration and predatory manipulation, creating a legacy of misunderstanding that endures. But the true modern consequence is a paradox of memory. While the event is remembered, its lessons are often simplified and dangerously misunderstood. The phrase "drinking the Kool-Aid" entered the popular lexicon, a flippant metaphor for naive conformity. It's used in boardrooms and political commentary to describe someone who unquestioningly follows a flawed idea. Yet this casual phrase is a profound desecration of the truth. It sanitizes the horror. It erases the coercion, the desperation, the years of psychological conditioning, and the armed guards who stood by as children were forced to drink poison from syringes. It ignores the fact that it wasn't even Kool-Aid, but a cheaper generic Flavor-Aid, a small detail that underscores how easily the truth is distorted. Most importantly, it erases the resistance. It silences the voices on the final death tape who argued, who pleaded, who screamed no, only to be forced into submission. It reduces the complex tragedy of human hope, fear, and murder into a simple, dismissive cliché about foolishness. This simplification is the most insidious legacy of all. The mechanisms of control that Jones perfected did not die with him in the jungle. They have simply evolved, becoming more sophisticated and diffuse. Today, they exist in the digital echo chambers of social media, where algorithms create curated realities that reinforce belief and demonize dissent. They thrive in the charismatic pull of online personalities and political demagogues who foster an us versus them mentality, mirroring the very siege mentality Jones cultivated in his isolated community. The search for belonging, for purpose, for a savior who can make sense of a chaotic world is a timeless human impulse. Jonestown stands as a permanent, chilling reminder of where that search can lead when critical thinking is surrendered and a single voice is allowed to become the only truth. The physical jungle may be gone, but the architecture of control is all around us. Quieter, more subtle, and woven into the very fabric of our modern lives. But to truly understand the weight of this architecture, we must look past the system and into the eyes of a single person trapped within it. We must hear a voice that tried to break through the walls of delusion, even as they were crumbling down. Her name was Christine Miller. She was not an enemy of the People's Temple, she was a product of it. A devoted follower who had moved her family across the world in search of a promised utopia. She had come to Jonestown seeking a sanctuary from the racism and economic hardship of America, a place where her children could grow up in a community built on ideals of equality and shared purpose. She believed in the dream. But on that final, humid night, as the vats of poison were being prepared under the dim lights of the pavilion, her belief was shattered by a horrifying reality. The air was thick with the smell of the jungle and a palpable collective fear. On the audio recording of those last terrible hours, her voice cuts through the madness. While Jim Jones, his voice slurring and paranoid, preached a gospel of revolutionary suicide, and while many chanted in agreement, Christine pleaded for another way. "I feel like that as long as there's life, there's hope," she argued, her voice trembling but clear, a fragile thread of reason in a tapestry of insanity. She wasn't just begging, she was reasoning. She reminded them of the babies, the children whose lives had barely begun. She questioned the narrative they were being fed, asking why they couldn't flee to Russia, a plan Jones himself had long promised as an escape route. She was appealing to the parents, the friends, the people she had lived and worked alongside, asking them to see the human cost of this final, irreversible act. But in a world built on the systematic destruction of the individual will, her reason was treason. Jones's voice, amplified and distorted, turned the full force of the collective against her. He didn't debate her points, he attacked her character. He called her a troublemaker, questioned her loyalty, and framed her love for life as a betrayal of their cause. The crowd, her neighbors, responded on cue. They shouted her down, their voices overlapping in a chorus of condemnation. It was the system's immune response, violently rejecting the foreign body of independent thought. Her logic was drowned in a tidal wave of manufactured paranoia and peer pressure. In that moment, Christine Miller represented the last flicker of the human spirit fighting against the machine it had helped to build. Her struggle and her inevitable failure is the ultimate human story of this tragedy. Her silencing was the final psychological execution, the point of no return that made the physical horror to come a mere formality. It is the story of a mind trying to escape a prison it could no longer recognize, a chilling testament to how even the most righteous ideals can be twisted into a cage that demands not just obedience but life itself. Jonestown is not a story about a distant, bizarre event that belongs to a forgotten decade. It is a mirror, polished by time, held up to the face of our own humanity. It reflects our deepest, most primal vulnerabilities, the profound ache to belong, the yearning for simple, absolute answers in a world of dizzying complexity, and the terrifying ease with which we can surrender our own judgment to a charismatic authority who promises to carry our burdens for us. It is a tempting and dangerous comfort to see the people of Jonestown as other, as weak, foolish, or fundamentally broken. To do so is to build a wall between their fate and our own perceived safety, to whisper to ourselves, "This could never happen to me." But this is the greatest delusion of all. They were not a monolith of the naive. They were doctors who had taken an oath to heal, lawyers who had sworn to uphold justice, loving parents, and hopeful children. They were idealists, activists, and seekers, people who looked at the deep wounds of a divided America, its racism, its poverty, its hypocrisy, and dared to believe a better world was possible. Their journey into darkness began not with a leap into madness, but with a series of small, rationalized steps away from the world they knew. It was a minor compromise of conscience, then another and another. It was the slow, creeping tide of conformity, where each surrendered piece of individuality made the next surrender easier. The knot of control tightened so gradually they didn't feel the pressure until it was too late to escape. At no single moment did over 900 people decide to end their lives. Rather, they made thousands of smaller decisions to isolate themselves, to trust one voice above all others, to police each other's thoughts, that led them to a final, inescapable conclusion within a universe of manufactured logic. The ultimate safeguard against this abyss is not found in grand ideologies or political systems, but in the quiet, resolute, and often lonely power of a single questioning mind. It is the courage to be a Kristen Miller in a pavilion filled with chanting voices. Her bravery was not just in speaking truth to power, but in the monumental effort of holding on to her own internal reality against the crushing, unanimous weight of the collective. This is the bedrock of human dignity, the sanctity of the individual conscience, the right to say no when the world screams yes. It is a right that, once surrendered, is almost impossible to reclaim. A true community does not demand this sacrifice. It is not a monolith, a single organism with a single brain. It is a tapestry woven from countless different threads, gaining its strength and beauty from its diversity of thought and experience. It supports the individual rather than consuming them. The tragedy of Jonestown was not just the loss of over 900 lives. It was the death of over 900 individual worlds, each with its own unique constellation of hopes, memories, and dreams, all consumed by a singular destructive vision. It serves as an eternal epitaph, a warning carved not in stone but into the very memory of history, that the road to paradise, when paved with blind faith and the surrender of the self, often leads directly and inexorably to hell. The physical jungle may have reclaimed the land, but the psychological architecture of control remains, a blueprint for any who would seek to build their own kingdom on the ruins of the human will. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If you believe these stories must be told, consider subscribing and sharing your reflections below. It is in our collective memory that their lessons endure.